Okay, I know people are still starting to log in, but I'll go ahead and welcome you to PNP Live. My name is Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be dropping in the chat to purchase Manywhere, Stories by Morgan Thomas. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A, which can be found along the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everybody's questions, but I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, simply click on the live transcripts option, also at the bottom of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speakers. Morgan Thomas's work has appeared in The Atlantic, the Kenyon Review, American Short Fiction, the Yale Review, Electric Literature, and Story Quarterly, where their story won the 2019 Fiction Prize. They are the recipient of a Bread Loaf Work Study Grant, a Fulbright Grant, the Penny Wilkes Scholarship in Writing and the Environment, and the inaugural Southern Studies Fellowship in Arts and Letters. They have also received fellowships from the Sewanee Writers Conference and the Arctic Circle. A graduate of the University of Oregon MFA program, they live in Portland. Thomas will be in conversation with Karen Thompson Walker. Walker is the author of the New York Times bestselling novel, The Age of Miracles, which has been translated into 27 languages and named one of the best books of the year by People, the magazine, and Financial Times, among others. Her most recent novel, The Dreamers, was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. She is an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Oregon. Morgan and Karen, and that's my dog. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. And thanks to Politics and Prose for hosting me this evening. Karen, also, thank you for being in conversation with me. I feel really lucky to have worked with you at the University of Oregon and excited to talk to you this evening. And then last, thanks to all of you for being here and sharing some time with us. I'm going to begin with a short reading from the title story of the collection. So this is the beginning of the story, Manywhere. My father walks circles around my kitchen. After 20 laps, he pauses to chart his progress on a road atlas lying open beside the sink, mile by mile. He wears off-trail boots, the laces double knotted over knee socks. His calves above his socks are bare, smooth as well-oiled pistons. Hey, Dad, where are you walking? He's been walking so long he's worn through the laminate to the floorboards. From the sofa where I write this, I can see the polished boards, the places where he's dusted the floor just by shuffling across it. Hey, Dad, aren't you there yet? Last time I checked his atlas, he was on the long trail north of Ethan's Gap, his progress charted by a trembling black line. That was days ago. By now, I guess he's well into Quebec. He's crossed the St. Lawrence, paused to cool his blistered feet in the river. From the bend in his back, the heel-heavy clump of his boots, I bet he's walking uphill. When I stand at the stove to fry gritty bread, he brushes past me without a word, as if I'm a tree or a fence post or an outcropping of rock encroaching on his trail. I'm the child he didn't choose, born to a woman he wasn't planning to marry in the summer of 1992. That year he walked the picket line, paced the pavement outside Paradise Hotel and Casino. My mother walked with him. When they broke for lunch, he taped her feet, taped across the top of her toes to prevent fall blisters, layered her hot spots with benzoin and petroleum jelly, bathed every sore with a sponge dipped not in water, which would sting the open skin, but in skim milk, pasteurized. This is the memory my mother offered when, as a child, I asked about romance. She offered it as proof of his love, but he taped the feet of everyone who walked the line. They called him Moleskin because he always had it handy. My mother got big with me. She got tired. She got a job at Vintage Pizza, which sat right across from the casino. Her wages paid the bills while he walked. When I was an infant, she kept me strapped in a car seat in the utility closet. When the front was slow, she sat on an upturned bleach bucket and nursed me or pumped. She kept one eye always on the picket line where he paced back and forth. She knew once a man starts walking, it's hard to stop him. They didn't last. When I was 4, my father walked out on her, and my mother moved in with her sister, took me along. For years, I didn't see him. We didn't speak. During those years, my father reinvented me. He made me in his image, which is to say, he made me walking, a walking daughter, one who would follow him. He's told me about her, his walking daughter, as he rings my kitchen island. Told me she went to the University of Alabama on a soccer scholarship, led backpacking trips in the summer, studied accounting, married in her 3rd year, never finished her 4th. Now she has a kid and a job at the cutting table at Joann's, sliding a pair of snips up the sheer guide for minimum wage. That's not true, I say to him. That's not real. I say this every time he brings her up. It's important to me, keeping him in check, letting him know when he's gone off into delusion or dream. I don't resent his invention of her, but I resent the life he created for her, for me, a life with no room for choice. He showed me photos to prove she exists, photos of myself from 3 years ago, back when I still looked like a woman, photos I can't stand to look at and certainly don't remember sharing with him. In them, I'm grinning with a toddler in my arms. Isn't that your cousin's kid? I ask him, but he insists it's hers. I'm posing in front of an Oaks Cross section with a man I'd never choose, thick-limbed and unsmiling, a military haircut. Is that my old coworker? I ask. Her husband, my father says. She's not real, I tell him. But part of me always believed in her, or wanted to believe. I waited for her like a banana spider hung between 2 leaves. I kept a full set of my old clothes for her. I kept beer and cigarettes in the cabinet above the fridge because he said those were her go-tos. I prepared to hand him off to her. I'd been living 6 months with my father. It was her turn. I used to wonder if I'd seen her, body surfing in the bay, buying scallops at the public seafood counter. I once bummed a cigarette and a maxi pad off someone in a CVS parking lot who might have been her. Then, 3 days ago, I met her. I saw her sitting at the bar inside Sandshaker, a backpack leaning against her stool. She was sipping a margarita through a straw. I slid in. I bought her a drink. She said, I'm married. I said, I know. We looked similar, same eyes, same pebbling of acne scars on our jaw. She didn't mention this, so neither did I. I didn't ask about the specifics of her life. I had no desire to hear them confirmed. Instead, I asked, did you walk here? Leave it there.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just reminded again of how amazing you are with detail. Like the number of imaginary settings that were packed into that section so naturally and vividly. It's amazing. So it was a pleasure. So first of all, just congratulations, Morgan, on this wonderful book. It's really beautiful and original and innovative. And it's just a joy to get to do this with you today. Especially since I did encounter you for the first time as a graduate, when you were a graduate student. So it's just so exciting and satisfying to get to be here with you. Thank you. So I think I'd like to start off by asking you to describe, in your own conception, what you think links these stories. And then maybe related to that, did you think of these stories as thematically linked as you were writing them, or did that realization or that sense come at a later stage?
Yeah. So I think the way that I think about the linkages between the stories in Manywhere, these are all stories that are asking about the ways that we build our own self-mythologies and our own narratives based on the people that we encounter, whether those are people who are our contemporaries, who we encounter in our day-to-day lives, or whether those are people that we're encountering in the archives or in other stories. And those questions became clear to me after I had written 3 of the stories, Taylor Johnson's Lightning Man, Alta's Place, and The Expectation of Cooper Hill. So I'd written those stories sort of separately. And then as I was revising them with friends, I realized that there were similarities between them, that they were all asking about this process of self-mythology and about lineage. And once I realized that, the collection itself and the vision of it started to cohere.
Mm-hmm. And was one of those like sort of the first one, or those were ones you were sort of, working on simultaneously in a way?
I was working on the 3 of them simultaneously. I think I wrote Taylor Johnson's Lightning Man first, in terms of the very first draft. I know that Frank Woodhull was sort of the historical figure that that drew me into this process of reflection on our self-mythologies and our searches for lineage. So I think that was the first one.
I feel like it's such interesting questions that I don't feel like, it doesn't feel like something I've read in fiction so directly and insightfully before. So it feels like one of the things that makes it so interesting. So I think I feel like when I read your work at the University of Oregon, I always felt like it was wonderfully atmospheric and emotionally arresting. And it was just such a pleasure to see those things in this book, as in this whole book. But one thing and I don't know if it just happens to be the stories that I read, but I don't remember them taking place in history or having this relationship with history. And it could be that you were already working on that in other classes, but it does make me curious, sort of, how did you first arrive at that thread? Because I feel like it is one of the things that really enlivens and links these stories.
Yeah, you're right. I don't think I was writing about history or historical lineage when I was in grad school. Transit is the only story that I think I workshopped in a grad school workshop, but I wasn't thinking about that as part of the collection until towards the very end. And then I kind of went back and revised that story. So yeah, the others were written later, and it really began when a friend told me about Frank Woodhull and told me a little bit of Frank Woodhull's story, which inspires the first story in the collection. And I found myself just really interested and fascinated by Frank Woodhull, a fascination that I think bordered on obsession. And I was reading newspaper articles, and I was seeking like excerpts of dissertations that talked about Frank Woodhull. And I felt this tie, like the sense of kinship. And increasingly, as like weeks went by and I continued down this sort of path of fascination, I became skeptical of like the fascination itself, I think, or of this sense of kinship that I had with Frank Woodhull. And so that's when I think from there, other like aspects of historical figures made their way into the stories, because I became interested in like the actual process of my own feelings of obsession and fascination with those lives.
Do you want to tell us a bit more about who Frank Woodhull was, and then also what do you think the nature of that kinship you felt with them?
Yeah, so Frank Woodhull was a person who came through Ellis Island in 1908. And one of the things that I always feel when I start to talk about Frank Woodhull's story is the sense that I don't actually have language to describe Frank Woodhull's gender identity. And I also don't know what pronouns to use. So like newspaper articles of the time used she and her. Like Frank Woodhull at the moment that Frank Woodhull came through Ellis Island, was dressed as a man, was living as a man, had been living as a man for many, many years. So had been using he, him pronouns in Frank Woodhull's life. And so I feel myself like arrive at this sort of gender confusion, I think, even when I just try to tell the story. And in the process of coming through Ellis Island, Frank Woodhull was pulled aside for a medical examination. Like the gendered confusion was discovered in this moment, and Frank Woodhull had to go before the Board of Special Inquiry to essentially petition for the right to enter the United States. At that time, a woman who was not like chaperoned by a family member or a husband was unable to enter the United States. So there were like all these different gendered components to Frank Woodhull's experience in this moment. And at the end of the day, Frank Woodhull was allowed to enter the United States. And the newspaper articles of the time like talk about this in really interesting, like sort of glowing language. Like they're really complimentary about Frank Woodhull as a sort of like an example of a person who has like a sort of Protestant work ethic, and like the newspapers use phrases like put on men's clothes to get by in the world, as though this sort of gender presentation was like a way of of working hard and like making it. And so it was really interesting to me because the coverage of it was so complimentary. And then Frank Woodhull disappears, right? We don't know. It says there's like one line in an interview where Frank Woodhull's like, I'm going to New Orleans because I think I can find work there. And then I could find very little about Frank Woodhull's life beyond that point. And so I think the kinship that I felt is just this sense of not knowing how to describe Frank Woodhull's gender identity, and of understanding that it didn't conform easily to the expectations of gender in 1908, and potentially wouldn't even conform to expectations of gender in 2021.
So anyway, thank you for giving us all that interesting backstory about him. So for you as a fiction writer, what sort of what sort of opportunities do you feel like it gives you working with a figure like Frank Woodhull? But also, what kind of like risks or responsibilities did you feel?
Yeah, in terms of risk and responsibility, I think the central one was around gender, and that's why in the story I use like you to refer to Frank Woodhull, and I to refer to the narrator, so that I don't have to make any claims about gender, because I know that Frank Woodhull was a person who lived, and I don't want to flatten Frank Woodhull's experience of gender in any way by imposing my own understanding upon it when that understanding might be inaccurate. And then in terms of what fiction offers, I think that fiction allows me to direct the story towards specific questions that I might not be able to ask as easily in a realm of nonfiction or of more like specifically researched work. And that is what I'm essentially interested in is, again, this process of self-mythology. So I'm not so much interested in trying to like understand like the nuances of Frank Woodhull's understanding of gender identity, or to like figure out what label would be most appropriate, right? Those questions are actually less interesting to me than this phenomenon of Taylor Johnson, a fictional character, interacting with a Frank Woodhull, who is both based on historical reality, historical fact, and is also in some ways a construction of Taylor Johnson's mind and Taylor Johnson's desires and Taylor Johnson's need to find a sort of model for Taylor Johnson's gender identity, right? Which is something that that narrator is working through in the story. And so I think in fiction, I'm able to put down a piece of myself, that piece of myself that was obsessed with Frank Woodhull. I can put it down on the page and give it to Taylor Johnson, the narrator. And then that allows me to look at it. I distance myself from it. And the story ends up having a sort of layered narrative effect where I'm looking at Taylor Johnson, who's looking at Frank Woodhull. And that layering is what I think I'm essentially interested in.
Right. And I think that layering, it feels like that's part of what gives these stories so much life. I think it seems like there's a similar dynamic in one story that I particularly love, which is The Daring Life of Philippa Cook the Rogue. And I was just so curious. I mean, for one thing, I just love how you bring to life the kind of epicness of this person's life, but at the same time, there's a lot of sort of small, intimate moments that, take place 400 years ago. And I just was so curious how do you pull that off? And also how near or far that story is, I mean, the sections that are about Philippa is from reality.
So that story was inspired by Thomasine Hall, Thomas and Thomasine Hall, who was a person who lived in colonial Jamestown. And what I know of Thomasine Hall's life is centers around a trial transcript, which was the inspiration for The Daring Life of Philippa Cook the Rogue. And the transcript that opens that story is a sort of adaptation of the actual trial transcript, in which Thomasine Hall stands before this quarter court in Jamestown and says, I am both a woman and a man, and also talks really openly about sex and sexuality. And when I found that transcript, I was just astonished, I think, honestly, to find someone talking about gender and sexuality in those ways, centuries ago. And then I could find, again, and the sort of punishment of that's in the story of having to wear a combination of men and women's clothing was the punishment for Thomasine Hall in that transcript. And then beyond that, I could find nothing really of Thomasine Hall's life. And so this is, again, where I think fiction allows for a lot more freedom. I deliberately created a different character in the Daring Life of Philippa Cook the Rogue, because I didn't want to, again, impose my own understandings or wishes or hopes upon Thomasine. And within that creation of a new character, I think I was able to imagine possibly a longer and possibly like a more contented, a more joyful life for a genderqueer character in colonial Jamestown. That was at least one of the things that I was thinking about, that I think you mentioned, with like the intimacies and the different aspects of the story. Not that it was an easy life, but I think that there are aspects of joy within it, which felt important to me. And I think I was also just able then to do a lot of imaginative work with Philippa's life and Philippa's history that I wouldn't have been able to do if I was trying to stay true to like the record of Thomasine Hall and what is known and what is not.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love in that story how it's all, I guess I would call it an epistolary story in a way, or at least it's all letters and documents. And I think that it creates a really interesting effect of sort of space between. Like we get these flashes of documents, including the contemporary emails about someone who is really interested in this figure, and it gives this really satisfying and appealing looseness, so that like it sort of, I think it just sort of reflects the kind of unanswerable quality that the story seems interested in. Sort of like these are things, and even maybe some of the letters are frauds anyway, but it's like I just love how the whole thing lives in a kind of there's a feeling of like incomplete knowledge, and yet it's still so compelling, you know. I mean, like even in the incomplete arc of Philippa Cook's life, this contemporary person is getting so much inspiration and yeah, I don't know, engagement. Anyway, so sorry, I didn't want to cut you.
No, I just think that, yeah, the idea that the letters are forgeries is also, I think, in some ways it's my own attempt to like tread lightly around like history and historical figures. And I think also, again, it's like a focusing on specific questions. So it's hopefully the final story is less about sort of like the truth or the falseness of this particular portrait of a life of a gender expansive person in colonial Jamestown, and more about the way that the construction of that life and this like glimpse of it becomes vital to the narrator's understanding of their own gender identity in the current moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, let's see, I know you sort of mentioned that you have a sort of skepticism about even in yourself, your own sort of impulse to self-mythologize based on these historical figures. And I read in an interview something you said, which was that you wanted Manywhere to be looking with a critical eye at the process of building narratives of self and self-mythologies based on the lives of other people. And I just wonder if you could tell us more, maybe specifically about that critical eye. I feel like we've talked about, I think, how meaningful it can be, that process of self-mythologizing, but I'm curious, you know, yeah, if you could say more about your interest in looking at a critical eye at that process.
Yeah, I think I think about this in two ways. I think one of those ways, if we think about stories like Alta's Place and The Expectation of Cooper Hill, I think in both of those stories, we're seeing white settlers who are queer, gender queer, and who are crafting these narratives of themselves in ways that sometimes exoticize and or overlook, either exoticize individuals who are not white and or are overlooking aspects of like structural racism and white supremacy in their own histories or in these people that they're modeling identities off of. And so I think that it feels to me like there's a danger if we're modeling our identities on the stories that we're seeing around us and the people that we're interacting with, and we're not reflecting on that. I think there is a danger of appropriation and a danger of like doing active harm in that instance, because the individuals that I was finding throughout history, because I was looking for lineage that was specific to my own lived experience. And so as like a white settler, I felt like it would be appropriative, right, to be saying that like a person who is Indigenous or a person of color who lived before is a lineage that I can draw upon. And so I think because of that, it felt like I needed to be really careful and reflecting on the ways in which like that modeling process was happening within myself. So I think that that's one axis of it. And then I think specifically with regard to gender and sexuality, there's a second axis, and that is that I feel like models are really key, have been really key in my own understanding of my gender identity. I don't think that I would understand myself currently as a genderqueer person if I hadn't seen that gender identity modeled around me. And then also simultaneously, I think that if we hold too tightly to a specific model of gender identity or of sexuality, then that could actually limit or circumscribe our own experiences. So I think, for instance, about trying to understand the word genderqueer as a word that simply describes my gender identity, as a word that is like actively affirming of that gender identity, and not as a word that describes like some other thing that I need to become, some other thing that someone else is that's being modeled for me externally that I need to fit myself into. And so that feels like a space where, again, I need to reflect on this process of modeling my own self-narrative on another, and understand that as only part of the process. There's a second part of the process, which is actually making space within this constellation of models for my own understanding of gender identity or of sexuality.
Great. I feel like your stories do this so beautifully. Since we've talked so much about the historical elements, I thought maybe we should, I wanted to ask you sort of, and of course these same questions are circulating in both, and even the historical ones, as you've said, we end up in a way they're focused on the contemporary person who's looking back. But I am curious, do you feel like there's a fundamental difference in your writing process or in your imaginative process when you're working with material like the story Bump that seems sort of entirely, contemporary in its in its interests? Do you feel like that feels different to write in that, or or just a similar? I don't know. Just curious how different it feels to imagine a contemporary person only and not without the historical parallel.
I think that the process of creating the story or the process of sort of finding the story is different. So for instance, like the finding of Philippa Cook the Rogue was finding that transcript and immediately feeling this sort of sparky feeling of potential and possibility and excitement, and the story writing itself and evolving from there, versus a story like Bump or Surrogate, where in both of those cases, I think the seed of the story was within conversation with friends and community and and other like colleagues about gender and about our current like ideas and conceptions about pregnancy and childbirth, and how like those things are not always inclusive of trans folks. And so then the story grew out of those conversations and the things that I was thinking about within those conversations. So I feel like the seed is different. I don't know if the writing process itself is different, but I think the beginning is.
The sparky feeling comes from a different place.
Yeah.
So before I ask my next question, I just wanted to remind everyone that we're going to open it up to audience questions and in a little while. And so if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them shortly. Let's see, I think maybe we'll shift gears a bit and talk some about the setting. All the stories in this collection are set in the American South, and I'm curious about what role you see the South playing in these stories. I read that you said in an interview that the type of queerness and gender queerness that is centered in Manywhere feels to you like a Southern queerness or gender queerness. And I'm just curious to hear what does that mean to you, and how do you see that playing out in the characters of your collection?
Yeah. So I think the South plays a role in the collection in several different ways. I think the landscapes of the South and the constant fluidity of like the beaches of the Gulf Coast, especially in this moment of climate change, feel really present in stories like That Drowning Place and in Manywhere. I think, again, as a white settler who's writing in the South, I feel really aware of histories of colonization and slavery and the continuation of those legacies today. And so I think I feel a responsibility and an accountability as a writer, both not to look away from those historical aspects and also to recognize in my work and in my person the way that like structural racism continues today, and to work towards dismantling those things in my life and in my writing. So in that way, the South feels like it holds me to account in a specific way. And then I think last, in part, I wanted to write Manywhere because I think I didn't always see myself as a genderqueer person reflected in the stories that I was seeing told about the South. I think I was seeing queer and genderqueer people often in stories about like urban centers on the coasts, and less in stories about Alabama and South Carolina and Mississippi and the Florida Gulf Coast. And so I wanted to write a bit into that gap. And I think to what you're saying about Southern queerness and gender queerness, this is something that I'm just starting to think about and that I feel still like uncertain. Like I'm still thinking about. I think the thoughts feel half formed, but I would say that to me, my understanding of gender feels specific to place. And when I moved recently from Portland, Oregon to South Carolina, I realized that my gender presentation shifted a little bit, and I think that in Portland, Oregon, it's really easy for me to be read as genderqueer and to get they, them pronouns. And here, I'm more likely to get either like she, her pronouns or he, him pronouns. And so there's a sort of change in what feels affirming for me here is to be misgendered as a man, right? I'm not a man, but like that feels like a certain aspect of affirmation, or it feels affirming to have like some people use she, her, and some people use he, him. And there's something affirming within this like gender confusion that happens. And that feels specific to this place, right? That's not the way that I feel affirmed in Oregon. In Oregon, I feel affirmed because people use they, them pronouns. And I'm not totally sure what that means about my own like internal gender identity, but I think increasingly I'm becoming interested in a sort of geographical gender fluidity, or in a sense that my understanding of gender is actually specific to where I'm living, and changes as that changes as well.
Yeah, I feel like it's a really fascinating, it's fascinating to, and kind of maybe, I don't know, like quiet, like maybe something when you're in Portland, Oregon, it's harder to, I mean, I don't know how to speak for you, but I imagine it's harder to think about that, but then having a shift, it's just fascinating to hear about your experience in changing thoughts in terms of where you are. Maybe, let's see, I have maybe one or two questions, and then I would love to switch to audience questions, but I thought it might be interesting for people to hear about your kind of overall development as a writer. You know, what were the sort of key moments or eras that led you to where you are today? And maybe specifically how you spent your time between finishing the MFA and the publication of or the selling of your first book.
Yeah, this feels like a really lovely time to offer gratitude to the people who I think sort of shepherded me along on that journey. So I would say that my early teacher, Mary Robeson in college, was the first person to help me to think of myself as a writer, and encourage me to apply to grad school. And then I think that the Meredith Toulousan was a really incredible mentor as well for me as I was beginning to write the stories in Manywhere, and helped make the publication of the actual book possible. So those are two people and two moments that feel like they were central in the publication of Manywhere. And then since the MFA, I've spent some time traveling and most of my time working in public health at an Indigenous Public Health Board in Portland, Oregon. And I would also just give much gratitude to my colleagues there who have been such incredible collaborators and thought partners as we work towards Two-Spirit and LGBTQ plus health equity, and have also made space always for the writing work to happen alongside. So I feel really grateful to them as well.
Well, that's great. I guess one last thing I would love to ask you about is the title. It's such a distinctive title, Manywhere, and I would love to hear, and it's the title of the last story in the collection, and I just would love to hear from you what that title means to you, and what made you pick it for the collection.
Yeah, so I had my incredible editor, Jackson Howard, was actually the one who like plucked it from the last story and said, I think this should be the title for the whole collection. And as soon as he said that, I knew that was correct. And I thought it was a word that I had invented, but then recently I actually realized that it exists. And according to, it exists at least on Urban Dictionary, which defines it as, I wrote this down because I liked it, pretty much, but not quite, almost everywhere. And
wow.
I'm not so that's what it means according to Urban Dictionary. But I think to me it just suggests expansiveness and
Yeah.
possibility and the
Mhm.
multiplicity of selves and of our self narratives, and I think also again this sense that queer and genderqueer people have existed in a whole variety of places across all of time and will continue to exist. And so I think that sense of expansiveness and of abundance, I think, also
Mhm.
feels present to me in the word.
Yeah, definitely, and present in the collection. I think it's really a great marriage of title and book. So maybe let's see. It looks like we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Let me just pull them up. This one is from Nick Anstead. Hi, Nick. And the question is, do you plan to continue exploring the history and mythology of genderqueer and trans people in future work? Are there other stories about gender you hope to tell?
Thanks, Nick. This is a really lovely question. It's funny, I was talking to a friend about like what I was working on next and about the questions that we ask and in books, and whether it's the same question for an entire career as a writer or whether the question shifts. And when I was talking to the friend, I was like, no, I think that these questions of like lineage and identities and models, I think I'm done with them. I'm ready to move on. I'm gonna like ask different questions. I want to ask questions about like how we relate to each other and polyamory and these different relationship structures. So I'm just gonna focus on those. And then like immediately upon beginning to write those stories, I realized that there's no way to actually just like pull the two things apart, right? That those stories about relationship structures and our ways of being with one another were inherently also asking questions about identity and lineage and self and the body. So yes, I think history and mythology will probably continue in a different form, I hope, in future work. And I think that what I'm just starting to explore around like geographical gender fluidity is something that I'm interested in continuing to explore in future work as well, in terms of other stories about gender that I hope to tell.
I feel like I kind of love, I kind of love writers, a lot of writers. I feel like the preoccupations, of course, they develop and evolve and new things get joined in, but like central preoccupations, I feel like a lot of times that animates a whole career. I don't think you need to purposely just follow your own interests and obsessions and preoccupations, I think. But it sounds great, the new territory you're moving into too. So let's see, another question is, were there stories that were left on the cutting room floor in the editing process? And if so, why?
Yeah, there was one story that was another story about a historical figure that I think I just couldn't quite find like the heart of the story as I was writing this collection. And so that story I'm hoping will make it into another collection. Something that I think it helped me to realize is I think that story was trying to ask questions about my like the immediate circumstances in my life in the moment that I was writing it, and I think that I tend to need at least like 3 to 4 years beyond like an immediate experience in my life to process that experience and be ready to put it on the page. And if I start that process too early, like if I try to write about something immediately, often the story just doesn't really cohere. So there's one story that hopefully will make its way out into the world and at a later time that didn't make it into Manywhere.
Right. I'm going to skip. There's one question here that I actually was also thinking about asking you. It's not from, I don't know the name of the person, but it says, were there specific books that helped in writing Manywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. River Solomon's An Unkindness of Ghosts was absolutely essential to my ability to embody characters on the page. Akwakia Mizi's writings like Freshwater and The Death of Vivek Boji, I think if I'm thinking about individuals who have written into gender expansive identities in ways that I found really inspiring, that Akwakia Mizi comes to mind. Jordy Rosenberg's Confessions of the Fox approached genderqueer identity and history and offers this really interesting like frame story of a trans man living historically, which I think inspired some of the same like historical obsessions within Manywhere. And then T. Fleischman is another genderqueer writer who was really inspirational as I was writing Manywhere.
Thanks. We have another question from D. Loeffler. And the question is just what are you currently reading?
I've read a few poems and I'm about to read a full collection by Meg Day. Those poems have been really incredible. On Nights When I Am Your Husband is the poem that my partner sent me that made me first interested in Meg Day's poetry, and I find it really beautiful. And then I just finished an early copy of Deep in Providence, which is a young adult novel by Riss Nielsen. It's about 3 teenage girls who are haunted by a friend who's died. And it's really, really lovely and is out in May. So I would also suggest that book highly. And then last, I'll say that I recently read The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Tsing and found it really inspiring and fascinating. It's about Matsutake and the way, like it uses Matsutake as a way to think about economics and ecology and this strange like global weirding moment that we are all living in, and was really insightful and wonderful.
Great, thanks. Do you want to say any more about anything more specifically about what you're working on now? Or, I don't want, writers can be superstitious. You don't need to say much more, but I'm giving you the opportunity because I know people will be interested.
Sure, yeah. So I am currently working on 2 different projects. One is a novel about 2 siblings who are traveling north from their flooded Florida home to Illinois. And it uses that journey to ask questions about what white climate-driven migration might look like and what colonization might look like in the ecologically queer 21st century. And then I'm also currently working on a collaboration with a visual artist here in this Southern Studies Fellowship in South Carolina. And we are using the lens of baptism to ask questions about ecological toxicity and watershed ecology and gender fluidity and evangelical Christianity in the South. So that, I don't know what that will end up being, but it's been a really fun journey.
Wow, yeah, that sounds like fascinating territory. I'm also curious about your novel. Can I ask you one more question about it?
Yeah, of course.
Do you imagine that it's set, a little in the future, or, clearly extreme floods are occurring right now, but I'm just curious, how you just as conceptually, like, how you imagine that?
Yeah, I imagine it as a very near future. And it's based on an Army Corps project that I think actually just in May of this year was given like the next level of the green light, which would divert an aspect of like part of the Mississippi River to try to save some of the low-lying lands in Louisiana, and would also displace many people and affect in major ways the ecology of the Gulf Coast. And so, yeah, I was asked once if it was speculative, and it is like, it's both like researched and in some ways historical, and also I suppose speculative. This is where I feel like I'm like, speculative fiction starts to feel really broad to me. One of the epigraphs in the Anna Tsing's book was an expert talking about like the ways that Matsutake mushrooms reproduce and evolve, and began like their explanation of this by saying like it's all speculation. And I feel like if our like scientists who are talking about ecology and evolution are saying all of that is speculation, then I feel like everything I write is like inherently speculative fiction, whether there are fantastic elements or not. So yeah, I think so.
So let me just throw out one more, just in case. Does anyone have any last questions before we wrap up? You could put them in the Q&A. I'm going to ask, while we wait for that, I'm just going to ask one last question. Do you feel like the transition from writing stories to a novel, I don't know, does it feel like a natural outgrowth or a totally different process? I one time had one of my professors, I think Nathan Englander, he said that the going from writing stories to a novel, his first novel, he said something like he might as well have taken up painting. Like he just felt like it's completely different. I don't know if my experience, it felt as different, but I totally get what he meant in that what a different beast it is. And I'm just curious what your experience has been.
Yeah, it has felt really different. And I found that the novel covers 3 days, and that interested me when I first started to write it, and realized that because my stories, I think, often are relatively elastic with time, or will cover a really long stretch of time. And I think that there was something about the fact that the actual novel itself would sprawl that made me need to like limit it in scope on some other axis. And so I have ended up really compressing the timeline of the novel. And that has helped me to figure out how the story itself will work.
Uh-huh. Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to reading it someday, whenever it's ready. And I think we'll probably wrap it up momentarily, but I just want to say thank you so much for answering these questions so thoughtfully. And everyone should read the book. It's great. And congratulations on all the wonderful response it's gotten so far. I feel like, oh yeah.
Thank you so much, Karen.
You're welcome.
Oh, what a lovely discussion. Thank you both so much. We have a couple of minutes left. And Morgan, you did talk a little bit about what you're reading now. We at Politics and Prose sometimes ask a bonus question when we have the chance. Is there something else I'd like to know from both of you? What's on your bedside table right now? What are you going to read next, Morgan? And what maybe you are reading now, Karen?
I will confess that I do not have a bedside table, but I feel like if I have the chance
on the floor,
yeah, they will be stacked on the floor. If I have the chance to suggest one other book, I would say Daphne Andreadis's Brown Girls, which just came out a few weeks ago in early January, is really, really incredible. Daphne is a friend, and I also had the pleasure of reading that book early, and it uses a choral voice to tell the stories of young women growing up in Queens, and is a really, really beautiful debut.
Thank you. Thank you. Karen?
I'm really curious to read that one too, because I'm obsessed with collective voice. So it's on my, theoretical to be read. The thing I just recently reread is Manywhere. And it was a joy to read again. But I think a book that I have read recently that, in a way, I was probably a little late to, but I really loved was Severance by Ling Ma. This is a few months ago, but it just has really stayed with me. I really recommend it.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. Again, for coming in here this evening and sharing such a wonderful discussion. As a reminder to everybody out there, I've dropped the link to Manywhere in the chat. It'll take you directly to the Politics and Prose website where you can purchase the book. While you're there, I hope you'll also check out our events page, and we'd love to see you again soon. But in the meantime, stay well and stay well read. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.